So I'd like to introduce to you some of my colleagues. These are not necessarily my co-authors in this presentation, but this presentation does draw somewhat heavily on the insights that's been gained from my involvement from a group called the State Extension Leaders Network. Here we are having a meeting where we're discussing the future of extension in Australia. So CELN is a gathering of extension leaders from government around Australia, and together with a few invited people like myself who contribute to the thinking about what's happening in relation to extension. And CELN strives to provide leadership and strategic direction in the development of state and national extension service delivery. Extension is a funny word. What does it mean? And increasingly what we're finding is that new people, in fact, many people in the room here, in the NRM agencies and so on, potentially don't realise that they're in the extension business. So extension is one of many policy instruments that are available to government agencies to attempt to create change. And the concern has been that this policy instrument, a legitimate policy instrument, has been perhaps overlooked in some ways or another. But we're also aware that extension as a discipline or as a discourse has been changing, and people have been disconnected from it in various ways. So there was a confusion about what the hell extension was, about what it might mean, and about what a definition for it might be. Now I can see very well why changing the name to practice change is convenient, and it certainly does convey more meaning to a lay audience, perhaps. Extension has a lot of meaning for those of us inside the extension arena, but not necessarily to those outside of it. The problem is that there are many other words that connect. Extension, perhaps, is much the same thing as all the words on the left-hand side, and the words on the right-hand sides are what I regard as the kindred disciplines. In fact, curiously, when you go around the world into different languages, you realise that the way that we talk about extension, that word, of course, is going to be different in different languages. Well, in other languages, potentially, some of the concepts on the right-hand side are also included. So, in my talk already, I've inferred that extension actually exists at multiple levels. Extension is a discipline. There are journals of extension. There are, including at the University of Melbourne in the past, although perhaps not at the moment, you have been able to do degrees in extension one way or another. So extension is a discourse or a community of practice of people doing things, of connecting with similar people who do things. But extension is also a policy instrument, one of the tools that governments have available to them to try and create a change in the way in which society does things. It's also a process or activity that people engaged in the business of extension do, and it also exists as an agency. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about the extension agencies when they mean perhaps the NRM agencies, perhaps the land care groups, perhaps the DPIs or the Departments of Agriculture or whatever. So extensions, the radical critique of extension that's made by some sociologists is that extension has uncritically promoted the products of agribusiness, and that this uncritical promotion has led to severe social and environmental impacts. But even the more moderated sort of reflection of what we might call traditional extension reveals that there's not enough thought given as to what's the appropriate theoretical basis by which change does occur. There was not enough awareness of the learning processes of farmers, of the knowledge base of farmers, or of the way in which farmers themselves were innovators, adapters, and how they themselves related to new products. The traditional model tended to regard all farmers as homogenous, as uniform, and that every practice that was promoted should apply equally, irrespective, as we heard about the lupins, and there it was a question of the soil type being different in different shires. But there's all sorts of other issues relating to a whole lots of social factors that are just passed over. So there's a shift from teaching, instructing as a sort of a directive approach to a learning process. There's a shift from public sector provision through to private sector provision, and the role of third-party providers, like all these NGOs that have an interest. There's a shift from one-to-one or face-to-face sort of extension to group extension. There's a shift from top-down to bottom-up. There's a shift from human capital, meaning what the skills, what are the skills that farmers have, to social capital, which is about thinking about the broader sort of social issues and their networks and what trust they have. There's a shift from information transfer, again as a top-down sort of concept, to capacity building. There's a shift from extension as an activity to extension as a policy instrument. And there's a shift also from producer to consumer. There's lots of things happening in society that facilitate these changes. In the time that we have, there's not enough time to argue all the points, of course. I refer you to that 12-page statement on extension, and I also would like to draw attention to a paper about where some of my ideas are also spelled out.
Thank you very much, Frank.